That rhetoric guy. Diddles. Pig sack. Data spot. Soapstone. Ugh. As a teacher, I've seen lots of different acronyms that well-meaning people have come up with to help students get started with rhetorical analysis. Most of these acronyms fail because they aren't able to condense and simplify the situation regarding any given text. So what exactly is this rhetorical situation, and how can we understand it simply? Analogy time. Isaac Newton described how objects move. In science, we call these descriptions laws, and they oftentimes take the form of an equation. But as time went on, physicists began to recognize that Newton's laws of motion, while excellent approximations, were missing something. His equations failed to take into account all kinds of other factors and aspects of reality. Along comes Einstein, who delivers a model that doesn't just describe a few factors of motion, but explains why that motion happens. In science, these well-tested explanations are called theories, and Einstein's general theory of relativity is our current explanation of gravity, that space and time are actually one thing, and massive objects warp that space-time around them, and that warping is what we call gravity. Theories are the pinnacle of science, but we only get these explanations once we've learned to describe what we see. Just like in the realm of physics, one of the major hurdles in understanding rhetoric is that there's a significant amount of seemingly tangential or extraneous information. But that information is actually quite important, and it needs to be taken into account. Now, if you've seen my last two videos, you know that rhetoric is the art and science of persuasion, and that persuasion is an interwoven web of appeals and choices. Now, if we are going to make our own informed rhetorical choices, or if we are going to analyze the rhetorical choices of some author in some given text, we need to start off with an equation of sorts, something that can begin to quantify all of this extraneous information so that we can describe the conversation accurately. If you can't describe the situation, you'll never be able to explain the rhetorical choices made in that conversation. Enter the rhetorical situation. Now, a lovely woman by the name of Dr. Teri Marshall introduced me to a simple acronym that is the equation that we need here. Now, at first, I was skeptical. I hate teaching acronyms. While some students like the structure they provide, my experience in teaching them is that most people either get very quickly annoyed because they don't really see how the letters build to anything, or they get confused because they're simply trying to memorize a process rather than really understand what they're doing. But after Dr. Marshall walked me through this little equation of hers, I realized that this acronym was a little bit different in a number of different ways. One, it's short and to the point, and that can reduce the amount of students who are just trying to memorize a process. Two, of all the extra extraneous information, this acronym actually narrowly focuses on what actually matters, the rhetorical triangle. And then finally, three, once you've done this, it offers a very clear grounding by which to begin to make rhetorical connections. So with some added nuance that I have added to Dr. Marshall's framework, here is our equation. CAPP, context, audience, persona, purpose. C is for context. This doesn't mean something as simple as a date, like the year 1513. What would that tell us? How would that help us? No, instead you should think about this more generally, like the time period, the zeitgeist, the mainstream beliefs of a certain place and time. Think about the major events of the era, the political power players of the day, the social issues people were worried about. In rhetorical analysis, we don't want to go too outside of the text and turn it into like a history paper or something. But it's still incredibly important to recognize and understand what gave rise to the text. If Martin Luther King Jr. had been speaking in the 1650s in America instead of the 1950s, do you think people would have heard him? Context matters because it allows us to explain why the author was so invested in writing what they wrote. Take away totalitarian governments? George Orwell probably wouldn't have written 1984. A is for audience. An important note, you are most likely not the audience. Yes, you may be reading a specific text for class, and so in a sense, obviously you're the audience, but that's not really what we're getting at here. We want to take note of the specific, primary, and intended audience of a text. If you're reading a letter, chances are that the audience is just one person, and it's probably not you. If you're reading a speech that an American politician gave to the Senate, the audience is not everyone, and it's not even all Americans. It is those specific senators whose minds that politician was trying to change. Once you've identified a specific intended audience, go a step further and explore what you know about that audience. If you've identified an audience of a bunch of old, rich, politically powerful white dudes, take note about what those attributes say about how that audience would perceive the speech of, say, a poor black escaped slave in the 1800s. Understanding how the receiver will receive the message provides us a large amount of options for understanding rhetorical choice. The first P is for persona. Like the previous two terms, you don't want to be simplistic with this by simply identifying a speaker. Rather, you want to think about this as if you're thinking about masks. We all wear different masks to different audiences at different times. How you talk to your mother is likely very different to how you talk to your friends. When I teach, I change my tone of voice and adjust my body language. If I'm furiously typing out an argument online, I judge whether I want to come off as prim and proper and properly educated, or more as a kind of rough and tumble guy who just cusses a lot and just kind of effortlessly sees the solution. Take note of how the speaker wants to be perceived, how they understand the situation they're discussing. The final P is purpose. Now, purpose I like to break down into three essential parts. And it goes like this: heart, head, hands. Starting with heart, this should be a single word. The emotion or primal drive that inspires the speaker to speak. It is their exigence, their need, their urgency. This could be something like fear, love, hate, pride, greed, survival. Once you have that heart-based primal drive in mind, the next step up is head. This should be an abstract phrase because it is a concept or an idea. It's the ideology that the speaker is fighting for. Examples might look something like to ensure equality or to inspire creativity or to promote skepticism. Once you have an emotional drive and a rational fight, the next step is hands. This would be the physical result that the speaker is advocating. And you'd want this to be as specific a phrase as you can get. Something like, to end wage slavery by raising the minimum wage to a living wage. Or to institute a policy of non-interventionism by withdrawing from overseas wars. Or maybe a little bit simpler, to get you to buy my product. If you can wrap your mind around each of those three aspects of an author's purpose, you're well on your way to truly understanding the piece that you're reading. Okay, so now we know what our equation is, but how do we use it? Well, if you are analyzing a text in preparation for a rhetorical analysis essay, here's what I would do. Number one, read the passage. Pretty obvious. Number two, make sure that you can summarize the passage and understand what it's trying to say. And if you can't, don't move on to the next steps until you can. 3, jot down your answers to each element of CAPP. You don't have to be obsessive about this and come up with a huge page of notes, but you should be clear and complete in your breakdown of context, audience, persona, and purpose. And then finally, 4, combine the most important answers that you've written down into a single sentence. This is the rhetorical situation statement. This is what your equation gives us as the answer to that equation. This is our description that we're going to use as a jumping off point to actually do our analysis. So this is the first sentence, essentially, of your rhetorical analysis essay, followed next by a specific thesis if you need one or can't integrate it into the statement itself. If you want an example of what this might look like, here's one. On an Independence Day celebration a few years before the Civil War, a justifiably enraged Frederick Douglass shames the white citizens of Rochester with brutal appeals to morality in order to shock them out of their hypocrisy and put an end to the ironic injustice of slavery in a free America. All right, to end, this might be a bit of a downer, but notice that the rhetorical situation and all the work we've done is not really analyzing rhetorical choice just yet. We haven't explained how things work. Rather, CAPP and this sentence are a description, a summary that ensures effective and complete analysis. It's the foundation of a house. Yes, you might be able to cobble a hut together without a concrete foundation, but you can't build a mansion on shifting sands. And likewise, you may be able to talk about some rhetorical choices without doing CAPP, but you won't really be able to build a complete argument without it. A final note for people who aren't really working on rhetorical analysis essays, but who are simply learning about rhetoric to improve their own writing choices. CAPP yourself. Want to write a letter to the editor of the New York Times? Well, examine the major attitudes and mainstream beliefs of the world that you live in. Evaluate the people who read the New York Times and try to meet or challenge their expectations. Think carefully about how you want others to see you and modify your voice or style to get it just right. Identify and quantify your purpose so that every paragraph you write is not just connected to your thesis, but integral to it.